Okay, hello everyone. I'm Geneva with the Levy Senior Center Foundation, and thank you all for being here for today's Levy lecture with Joyce Haworth, Debating Independence. And we've had Joyce present with us previously, but for those who may not know, Joyce Haworth is a U.S. historian and lecturer who has brought history alive for older adults for the last 20 years. She has focused her career on lifelong learning and community education, which has allowed her to go more deeply into historical topics in her lectures. She appreciates the knowledge and perspectives that seniors bring to her programs, and we're thrilled to have her back with us today. Now, if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to use the Q&A function on your screen to submit your questions. Joyce and I will read through those questions at the end of the presentation. And lastly, before we get started, this Levy lecture is made possible by the Levy Senior Center Foundation and the City of Evanston. And as always, we appreciate your support of the foundation. And with that, I'd like to now turn things over to Joyce.
Thank you so much, Geneva. And I just want to make sure I can only see you and I in the thumbnails. I just want to make sure that everyone is here. That's
Yes,
correct? Okay.
yes, we have
Okay,
50 people
great.
in the room with us.
Okay, very good. Well, hi everyone. It's good to see you here today. Um, Uh, and for thank you for coming for to debating independence, the American Revolution in 1776. I'm guessing that a number of you saw the Ken Burns special recently. Just that very magnificent, in-depth look at the American Revolution. And it's so appropriate because, of course, this is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, of the name United States first being used, of the flag with 13 stripes. And so I'm sure that all of us know at least the outlines of our independence story. But I wonder if you know that in the very midst of that struggle, in the very midst of the Revolutionary War, there was a debate about which direction the 13 colonies should go, whether the colonies should form their own nation or if they should reconcile with Great Britain. And I wonder if you know that those who favored reconciliation almost won. So that's my story today. Why the more difficult path of independence was embraced instead of the easier, perhaps sturdier route of reconciliation. Well, to get to that decision for independence, I want to start rather before 1776. Let's go to May 15th, 1775, to the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, now known as Independence Hall, of course, but not then. In that stately room, there were 12 tables arranged around a raised dais. 12 tables or 12 colonies. Georgia was not there yet. Georgia was still uncertain if they wanted to throw in their lot with the revolutionary movement. Georgia would be sending delegates in a couple of months after this. But this was the meeting space for the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress was the only intercolonial body that existed, and it wasn't even an official one. It was an unofficial one. It had met for the first time the fall before, as the First Continental Congress, to discuss long-standing conflicts with Great Britain. And they had agreed to reconvene at this time in May 1775 to see if those conflicts had all been happily resolved, you know? But they had not. Instead, a war was on. There was a British army barricaded inside of Boston, and an amateur American army of 16,000 camped around it. And the whole affair was kind of under the command of the Massachusetts militia officers. And so it had fallen to the Second Continental Congress to decide, what are we going to do about it? Swiftly, they discovered that they all agreed, yes, we have to prosecute this war. If we don't fight, we will lose forever any chance of local control of the colonies, any chance of continuing self-governance. And so Richard Henry Lee of Virginia rose and said, that being the case, the first thing we need to do is to create a national army. But then John Rutledge of South Carolina rose and said, hang on a minute, that is not the first thing to decide. The first thing to decide is, What are we fighting for? Is our aim reconciliation or is it independence? John Adams answered that one. John Adams of Massachusetts, an early advocate of independence, probably even in May of 1775, probably he was already secretly in favor of independence. But what he said out loud was, of course, not independence. We do not want independence. And I find that remarkable. This is only a year before the Declaration of Independence. Af After everything that had happened between Great Britain and her colonies before this, the colonies were still eager to reconcile. They had been through 10 years of on and off conflict, political conflict. Parliament at one point told the colonies that it was supreme over them in all cases whatsoever. And now bloodshed and war. And after all that, the colonies still wanted reconciliation. So what was up with that? What was the resistance to independence? Well, there was the not minor issue that any independence attempt would involve taking on one of the world's strongest nations. How could the American colonies win a war against a nation as strong and as warlike as Great Britain? But it wasn't fear, really, that was keeping the colonies in the empire. It was pride. Over the course of the past century, Britain had become a mighty nation, an empire. And until very recently, the Americans had been proud to be part of that empire. The first colonies had been founded over 150 years before. And after all that time, American Britons still very much maintained their British identity. The colonists didn't call themselves Americans. They were British subjects. They were proud of Great Britain's many accomplishments. They were proud of the English Constitution. The English Constitution, which was founded on the rule of law as opposed to the whim of a monarch. They were proud of the increasing military might of Great Britain. Over the decades, the colonies had grown so much, but they still had so many ties to the mother country. There was trade, of course. Americans were dependent on British imports, and they were fine with that. They liked British stuff, and they imported piles of stuff that British factories were already churning out at this early date. A rich man's house in New York had the same kind of furnishings and trinkets as one did in London. There were other things as well that drew them together. They spoke the same language. They were under the same legal code. They had the same literature. Wealthy Americans often sent their sons to school in London. Now, there were parts of the relationship that chafed over the decades, even in the best of times. For instance, if you lived in a colony, you were ever a second-class citizen of the empire. The purpose of a colony was to make the mother country stronger. By definition, colonies existed to benefit the mother country, to supply Great Britain with raw materials, things like lumber and beaver pelts and tobacco, and then to be a market for Britain's finished goods, things like furniture and plows and housewares and fabric and 1,000 other things. And Great Britain passed laws on the colonies to try to force them to adhere to this relationship. There were laws that said the colonies have to trade in British ports. And the colonies can't manufacture too much of this, and you can't manufacture too much of that. You got to buy your stuff from Great Britain. You can't make some of it. Some of it you cannot make yourself. But Americans cheated a lot on those laws, and Britain did not work too hard to enforce those laws for quite some time. And besides, American Britons paid a lot less in taxes than Britons did in the home country. So the long-standing inconveniences of the relationship were not too troubling to many colonists. But then Great Britain began changing things. That started around 1764, and this is part of a much longer story, but suffice it to say that beginning in 1764, the British ministry started to say, you know, those dang Americans, they're cheating on the trade regulations. They're not paying much in taxes. We just fought this expensive war, mostly in their territory. We're in debt for that. And every year there's a lot more of them. They're kind of running the show. They're running their own show over there. And Great Britain started to say, you know, we have to remind them that they are as much subjects of the empire as the people over here. we got to crack down on all this cheating on the trade laws, and we have to get them paying their fair share of taxes. And so the British government began doing things in America that they had never done before. And again, this is right around 1764, like prohibiting American expansion west. They said you can't go flooding into all of that land that was just won in the French and Indian War. You have to stay on the east side of the Appalachian Mountains. That land west is for the Native Americans. And they set about enforcing the trade regulations that Americans had been so happily ignoring. The British also set about passing direct taxes on the colonists, the kinds of taxes that had never been passed on them before. And because the government was anticipating trouble over all of this, they stationed more troops in America. And the Americans said, uh-oh, okay, now we're not going to war yet. It's only 1765, but still they said, uh-oh, change is in the air. We are being drawn more tightly into the British Empire. We are being drawn more tightly into this massive bureaucracy thousands of miles away. People who don't know us are going to be taxing us and regulating us more tightly. And also, they're messing up with our plans to get rich. They're messing up with our plans to grab some very rich, very desirable land on the other side of those mountains. All of this was very concerning to the American colonists. And Americans began to ask, is what Britain doing even legal? For instance, this business of direct taxes. It was down in the British Constitution that the people would be taxed only by their representatives. No taxation without representation, right? Americans should be taxed only by their colonial assemblies at home. And so began a decade of conflict, from the Stamp Act in 1765 to the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775. And the thing that really ramped things up, that really pushed the situation toward war, was the Boston Tea Party and the intolerable acts that followed. So the Boston Tea Party, that was late 1773. And I think it sounds kind of cute to us, right? Oh, the Boston Tea Party. Ha ha ha. They threw tea in the harbor and they called it a tea party. But neither side was laughing. Alrighty, I'm going to simplify kind of a complicated situation, but basically, the Americans believed that the British ministry was shoving their nose in the fact that they claimed the right to tax them. The British ministry was taxing one of their very favorite commodities, tea, just to make a point, just to assert their authority to tax. So when the tea ships arrived in Boston, Bostonians destroyed 46 tons of tea. That was worth some 10,000 pounds. 10,000 pounds works out to $1.7 million today. So Parliament said, pay for that tea. Massachusetts said, forget it. And Parliament punished Massachusetts with a series of laws designed to bring Massachusetts into submission. Parliament closed Boston Harbor. Boston depended on the harbor for almost all of its goods. So this would be like if a government closed all of the highways and railroads and air traffic into the Chicago area. This hurt Boston. Hunger was a real possibility. Parliament also dissolved the local government of Massachusetts. Massachusetts towns were no longer to have town meetings unless they got special permission. So this would be like the federal government, for instance, dissolving a state's government. It's of that magnitude. And then they passed a couple of other strong arm laws as well. The British called this group of laws the Coercive Acts. That shows where they're coming from, that they were exerting their authority. We're going to make these subjects be subjects. The American Britons called them the Intolerable Acts, and that shows where they were coming from. Local governance, local control was being stripped from Massachusetts. This is a political cartoon. It was first published in London. This is Paul Revere's engraving of it. It's called The Able Doctor, and it ran in a magazine in Boston in June of 1774. So there's America in the middle. She is depicted as a Native American, and she's supposedly being cured right, by by the able doctor, but actually you can see she's being assaulted by royal officials. So there's Lord North, the Prime Minister, pouring tea down her throat. And if you look closely, you'll see that she's spitting it back in his face. And there's other royal officials standing around, they're snickering. You see one of them there is peeking up her skirt. The woman hiding her face is Britannia, and she represents the British people who are refusing to see what's happening to the Americans. And then on the left, those two dandies are Spain and France, and they're plotting how to use these events to break up the British Empire. Well, the other 12 colonies vowed to stand with Massachusetts, and many people saw, even in 1774, that war was on its way. War between the colonies and Great Britain was on its way. That expected war broke out in April, the battles of Lexington and Concord. So that's how we get to this moment of May 1775, the Continental Congress meeting and deciding, well, we have a war on our hands. We have to prosecute this war if we're going to maintain our autonomy, even as colonies. But what we want is reconciliation. We want to go back to the good old days before 1765. So the first thing the Continental Congress decided was, let's send a nice letter to the king, a petition saying, hey, we don't want all of this unpleasantness. We are ever your loving and loyal subjects. We want to live in peace with you as our ruler on certain terms. Of course, we need to be able to run our own local affairs here like we always have. We need, of course, to be able to tax ourselves and so forth and so on. But we want to talk with you about these things. Send commissioners over so that we can hash through this and talk about the problems between us. This petition has gone down in history as the Olive Branch petition. And take a look at the signatures there. Some are very familiar, right? Some are going to be on the Declaration of Independence the next year. Look, there's John Hancock, once again, front and center as the president of the Continental Congress. And if you look more carefully in that list, you'll see Franklin and Samuel Adams and John Adams and some other familiar ones. Now, I'm going to be moving into the meat of this story now. But even as I do, I want to highlight that even while Americans were insisting, we are all about reconciliation. They were insisting on that was their goal, reconciliation. Nevertheless, they were already pretty hardened toward Great Britain. They were outraged at Britain's actions, and they were determined not to stand down. And in Massachusetts, they had already suffered, hadn't they? They had already shed blood. And they were prepared to suffer more for their rights and for self-determination. They were prepared to endure more warfare against Great Britain. The iron had already entered many a soul. Another thing to note at this point is that it was not only the Americans who were hardened. On the other side of the ocean, on the other side of this fight, somebody else was hardened. Someone who was done being nice to those rebellious Americans, who was already sure that the Americans were set toward independence. And his name was King George III. King George was certain that the Americans were vying for independence long before they actually were. King George thought the whole continent was trying to throw off British authority, and he had thought so ever since he first heard about the Boston Tea Party. So early 1774, he said to his prime minister, more or less, he said, aha, those Americans are in a state of rebellion. And he said, blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. He said we must either master them or totally leave them to themselves and treat them as aliens. And he said, I don't want to drive them to despair, but to submission. He said these things back in 1774, long before there was any kind of coordinated independence movement in the colonies. But the king was talking as if it was already settled, and he was resolved to crush it with the might and force of his country's war machine. And so, in due time, when the colonial representatives bearing the olive branch petition arrived in London, they bore the petition to royal officials who delivered it to the king. The king refused to even read it. What followed in late 1775 and into 1776 was a series of events that pushed Americans toward embracing independence. Some of these were strong arm tactics of the British, some were quiet moments of diplomacy from other sources. One was a book release with radical consequences. Each fell like a bombshell on colonial loyalty, damaging and weakening their devotion. The first of these bombshells came that fall, 1775, and in this case, they were literal bombshells. The British blew a New England town off the map as a show of power and force to demonstrate to the colonists what it was going to mean to rebel against the empire. The town was Falmouth, Massachusetts. Falmouth, Massachusetts, that is our current Portland, Maine. At this time, Maine was a province under the jurisdiction of Massachusetts. Falmouth had about 2,000 people. Falmouth was one of several towns that had gotten into some little skirmishes with the British that spring. And in the course of one of these skirmishes, some ships from Falmouth had briefly captured the captain of a British warship. That had happened back in May, and the British felt rather humiliated by that. So the commander of the Royal Navy there in the colonies decided, we're going to make an example of Falmouth to show everybody what they can expect. And so, on October 16th, 5 warships sailed into the Falmouth harbor. A proclamation was issued to the town saying that they had been guilty of the most unpardonable rebellion and that the ships were going to destroy Falmouth in 2 hours unless the town surrendered all of its weaponry. The residents of Falmouth chose to evacuate instead and let the British destroy their town rather than give up their weapons. And so let's note, again, the iron had already entered their souls. They were willing to suffer for this cause. The warships shelled Falmouth with some 3,000 shells and musket balls. Windows and roofs were shattered all along the waterfront. And then British sailors came ashore and set fire to the town. The town was reduced to rubble, and with winter coming on. The news of the attack outraged everyone who heard it. Even people in Great Britain were shocked. One London magazine, on reporting it, said, "It cannot be true." The French foreign minister called it barbaric and absurd. And the Americans were not cowed as the British expected. They were enraged. And as fate would have it, the news about Falmouth came to the Second Continental Congress right around the time that they were debating, should we create a navy? The moderates in Congress had been saying, no, let's not create a navy because colonies don't have navies, nations have navies. So if we create a navy, it will look like we're moving toward independence. But after the news that the British Navy had destroyed Falmouth, Congress swiftly voted to create an American Navy, to raise a couple battalions of Marines, to buy vessels that could be converted into warships, and hopefully to build 13 warships from scratch. Another strong arm move from the British Authority came just a couple of weeks after Falmouth. This time it was not New England, it was Virginia. The royal governor of Virginia appealed to the large enslaved population. He said, "Come and fight for us." So royal governor, the way it worked is the royal governor for these colonies, royal governors were appointed by the crown. So the royal governor worked for the crown, and then the assemblies were elected by the colonies. By this time, most of the royal governors in the South had fled their colonies, and they were living on ships off the coast of their respective colonies. And that included the governor of Virginia, John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore. He was a Scottish earl. So from his watery seat of authority, he issued a proclamation. He said, any enslaved people who are willing to fight for the British will be freed. All individuals being held in slavery who were able and willing to bear arms and joined His Majesty's troop to help with a speedy reducing of Virginia's rebels to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity, would be granted their freedom. About 40% of Virginia's population was enslaved. Now, we hear this very differently than the American patriots did. We hear this as finally someone is doing something about ending slavery. But Lord Dunmore was no abolitionist. Note that this invitation to enslaved people was only for those being held by rebels, not those being held by the Loyalists. And Lord Dunmore was sure not planning on liberating his own slaves. This order touched American patriots to the quick. What they heard was an invitation to race war. They heard Lord Dunmore saying to black enslaved people, come on and shoot up white families. Lord Dunmore eventually formed a regiment that he called the Ethiopian Regiment. It fought in 1775 and 1776. By the war's end, far more African Americans had fought for the British than against them. But Lord Dunmore's main intent with this proclamation was not to recruit black soldiers. It was to put that fear of a race war into the heart of whites. When General Washington heard about the proclamation, he thought, well, there goes the patriot cause in Virginia. He figured, this prospect of race war may well cause Virginia planters and other planters in the South to abandon the war. But as it turns out, just the opposite happened. Southern white Americans were outraged, and enlistments in Southern militias surged. But all of this did not push Americans into supporting independence. In fact, in the fall of 1775, people who talked too loudly about independence got into trouble. So, for instance, there was a certain militia unit in Pennsylvania, in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and this militia unit issued a sort of statement or proclamation that fall to the tune of, they and all good men were fighting for independence. And they got in trouble for that, for using the I word, independence. The local governing body of Pennsylvania took action, got a hold of the officers of that militia, and made them recant and swear that the company sought only a, quote, happy and speedy reconciliation with Great Britain. And bear in mind, this is no action of loyalists or Tories. This is a patriot militia being disciplined by a patriot body to shut down talk of independence. And yet, surely that fall, more people were saying quietly, this looks like this is going in one direction. And we do know for sure that some famous individuals were thinking that way because they are saying so in their letters. So, for instance, Benjamin Franklin wrote in a letter to a friend of his in Great Britain, he wrote this in October. He said independence is on his way. He said, I see clearly we are on the high road to mutual enmity, hatred, and detestation. A separation will, of course, be inevitable. 'Tis a million pities so fair a plan as we have should be destroyed by the mangling hands of a few blundering ministers. Ministers meaning government agents of Britain. And also Thomas Jefferson. At the end of November, Thomas Jefferson wrote to a friend that George III was about to undo his empire. And he said, we want neither inducement nor power to declare and assert a separation. It is will alone which is wanting, and that is growing apace under the fostering hand of our king. So he's saying we have all the reasons we need to declare independence. We're not we don't have the will yet. We're not quite to the moment yet. But don't worry, that's going to happen under the fostering, the nurturing toward our independence of the king. Little sarcasm there. Well, one day, in December 1775, in Philadelphia, a certain ship docked in the harbor of Philadelphia, and a man disembarked, a British citizen. He was Thomas London, Lord Drummond. Lord Drummond, a Scottish lord, not to be confused with Lord Dunmore. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia. This is a different guy, Lord Drummond. Lord Drummond was there as an unofficial envoy from the British Prime Minister. He had been sent to find out exactly what it was that the colonists wanted. Drummond had lived in the colonies for some years before. He had lived in New Jersey in the 1760s and the 1770s, so he had had a front row seat to the growing American conflict. And then once back home in England, he went to the prime minister and he said, maybe I can be useful. So Lord North sent him back to America with a job. Find out what the cost of peace would be. Find out what the Continental Congress really wants or what it will accept to stop fighting. And, said the Prime Minister, if it turns out that you can't get them to accept anything, see if you can get them to fight among themselves. Well, once Drummond arrived in Philadelphia, he found a way to send quiet messages to Congress about why he was there. And Samuel Adams said, let's arrest him. Samuel Adams of Boston, already forever opposed to reconciliation. But some other delegates said, hang on a minute, hang on. Let's hear what the guy has to say. So on the very day that he arrived in Philadelphia, Lord Drummond was meeting with certain delegates to Congress, while presumably Sam Adams fumed. The delegates who were rushing to hear what Lord Drummond had to say were the moderates. And at this point, the moderates were holding the power in the Continental Congress. They are from the Middle Colonies and the Deep South, and they are more cautious than the New Englanders or the firebrand Virginians. They are more dependent on Great Britain for imports and for markets than the northern colonies. Now, all the colonies were dependent in that way, but the Middle and the South were especially dependent on trade and markets. Living in the British Empire worked really well for the merchants and traders and tobacco growers of those regions. The British Navy made the seas safe for their shipping, and British markets were there for their produce. And also, the Middle and the South had not yet suffered from British violence, but they had sure suffered as a result of New England's actions. Some of those very delegates who were huddled with Lord Drummond were going to go on to be founding fathers, men like James Wilson and Robert Livingston and Robert Morris. Let's take a look at Robert Morris, for instance. Robert Morris was a wealthy merchant from Philadelphia. In early 1776, he was opposed to independence. Now, a year later, he was going to be in charge of the financial operations of the war. And as things went on and the United States' financial position got worse and worse, he would use a lot of his own money to shore up the finances of the United States. And he would borrow money for the nation on his own private credit because his personal credit rating was so much better than the credit rating of the United States. But he was ever a conservative patriot. When you look more closely at his career, you find that Robert Morris moved toward the patriot cause when it became more feasible financially to do so. Or, I'm just going to say it that he moved toward it when the potential to get very rich from independence grew more likely. I think people like Robert Morris needed a big, fat financial incentive to tip them over into the independence ranks. Let's try not to judge people like him too harshly for this. Let's put ourselves in their position. Let's say you were living in an era of civil uprising. And if you joined the side that you believed in, you might lose your property. You might lose your bank accounts and your investments and everything. But hey, keep your nose clean. You get to keep it all. Maybe you can weather the national storm with your life somewhat intact. Do you want to lose your house? I don't want to lose my house. I would have to be really sure it was worth the risk. What made independence worth the risk for men like Robert Morris? Well, short-term pain, long-term gain. The short-term pain of war and nation building, that would be set off by the long-term potential of greater control of your colony, greater control of your state. And then for men like Morris, it also included access to Indian land that Great Britain was preventing British Americans from moving into, and access to foreign markets that colonists were not supposed to trade at. They were all thinking about their financial security down the road, and we would too. And then the Deep South, too, had special concerns. The South was a whole lot closer to the Spanish than were the northerly colonies. Georgia especially. Georgia was the newest colony, and it was a very weak colony, and they were right next door to the Spanish possessions in Louisiana. So what's worse, being a colony of Great Britain or being a possession of Spain? Definitely, you would prefer to be a colony of Great Britain. The Georgians did not want to end up in the orbit of Spain. Each colony had its own independence story. Well, let's get back to Lord Drummond, huddled with the delegates. Drummond told them, the British government is impressed by you Americans. We are impressed by your grit on the battlefield. The British Parliament thought you guys would be pushovers, but now they know better. Drummond said, Lord North, the Prime Minister, wants to settle this without more war. So, how about this? I mean, you have to pay taxes, right? We all hate taxes, of course, but you are a possession of Great Britain, and that costs money. And you get a lot of benefits from being a possession of Great Britain. And as you know, Parliament has offered to make the tax burden of each colony just a small sum every year. And you can raise that money in any way that you wish. So, how about if you just agree to that? How about if you give up this notion that colonies should be taxed only by their colonial representatives and just accept Parliament's right to tax you? And the other thing is, you really have to publicly declare the Parliament is supreme over the colonial governments, that the government of Great Britain is supreme over the colonial governments. So, just those two things. Just submit to Parliament's right to tax you and acknowledge that Parliament is supreme. And Lord North, for his part, will ask Parliament to repeal the laws that are so odious to you. I promise. For 2 weeks, Lord Drummond met with the various delegations of the 13 colonies, and at one point he believed that he had 7 colonies on board with his proposal. 7 of 13. That's a majority of the colonies. So this is remarkable. After 9 months of war and the destruction of Falmouth, a majority of the colonies still wanted reconciliation. Well, which colonies, by the way? We don't know for sure, but surely New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, the middle colonies all. Surely Georgia, and probably South Carolina and North Carolina were also listening. Now came a watershed moment in Congress. The conservatives knew their strength, and they made their move. Let's kill the idea of independence once for all. Let's do it by forcing Congress to vote on the matter. Make the Second Continental Congress weigh in on the matter officially. Take a public stand. Odds are at this point that stand will be for reconciliation and not for independence. And so, on January 9th, 1776, James Wilson of Pennsylvania moved that Congress declare their present intentions respecting an independency, declare to their constituents and the world their present intentions respecting an independency. James Wilson, come July, he'll be signing the Declaration of Independence. But in early January 1776, he believed independence would be harmful to America. When he moved that Congress declare their intentions regarding independence, what he was banking on was getting a strong no, was getting a strong declaration for reconciliation. So Congress said, okay, that sounds right. Let's put it on the docket to talk about it. Let's give everybody 2 weeks to prepare for this debate, independence versus reconciliation. So Congress set the date for the debate for January 24th. And now we come to one of those great what if moments in history. What if the momentum toward reconciliation had continued? What if 7 colonies favoring reconciliation had become 9 or 10, a solid majority? What if Wilson's proposal had been debated right away when he maybe had the votes? Maybe there would have been a very different outcome. But Lord Drummond's mission fizzled because in those 2 weeks between Wilson's motion and Congress's debate on it, 4 things happened in America. 4 incidents that radicalized the wavering congressman, that radicalized thousands of Americans. These 4 events lit the fire that would continue to the writing of the Declaration. And the first two came that very same week. January 8th, the text of a speech that King George had given a few months before began to circulate in the colonies. And in that speech, the king declared war on his colonies. The king had said that demagogues have successfully labored to inflame my people in America, and their goal is an independent empire. And so he said, I do the only thing I can do. My only option is to crush the rebellion. So get ready, America. Come spring, large forces of Army and Navy are headed your way, unless you lay down your arms and submit. So the king is declaring war on the colonies, announcing they can expect only force or submission. King George also said he had received the most friendly offers of foreign assistance. That was code for I'm sending over mercenary soldiers. I'm sending over soldiers of fortune to use against British citizens. It was the custom at the time that if Britain's own military was short on manpower, it might hire mercenary soldiers to fight in their wars from Germany or from Russia or really from wherever. And soldiers for hire, mercenary soldiers, tended to be more brutal than regular soldiers. They tended to be more vile in warfare and more vile toward civilians. So this news was a gut punch. The king was sending over thugs that were more likely to behave like thugs, and he's going to use them against his own people. The news was sickening. 2 days later, the next bombshell fell. A political pamphlet began to circulate that asked, why do we need a king anyhow? And this was Common Sense by Thomas Paine. It's not often that we can point to a single publication and say this single source actually had a large impact on events, but this is one of those times. Thomas Paine was a recent comer to the colonies. He was an Englishman. He had come over only in 1774 to the American colonies. He was a revolutionary by temperament. He was a writer by talent. And he was a failure at pretty much everything else. But he could write, and he was opposed to overbearing government. Back in England, he had been facing debtor's prison when Benjamin Franklin met him in London and encouraged him to emigrate to America and use his talents for the growing conflict there. Once in America, it soon became clear that Paine was one of those remarkable people that revolutionary times brings to the forefront. Another revolutionary, Benjamin Rush, encouraged him to write something to help bring issues to a head, and so he did. Common Sense, this 50-page pamphlet. And in that pamphlet, Paine posed this question: what's so great about a monarchy? Can't we do better? That notion itself was radical. The usual answer to that is, of course, we cannot do better. Historically, monarchies seem to be the most stable form of government. Sure, they have their severe drawbacks. You get dunderheads on the throne here and there, but every form of government has its severe drawbacks. Monarchies offer the most benefit with the least pain. At least that's how most people in the British Empire saw it. Thomas Paine said, no! He said kings are part of the evil in the world. He said they are foolish and wicked and improper, and colonies always get the short end of the stick. Under the British system, colonies are supposed to serve the home country. We're supposed to be subordinate. That's part of the whole colony thing. So Thomas Paine said, the king is just using you to enrich the home country. So why fight for reconciliation? What are we getting out of the deal? Wasn't it common sense to say no to monarchy? Wasn't it common sense to fight for independence? 'Tis time to part. It was a powerful argument. Paine was saying out loud and in print what some people had been saying quietly. And it came at the perfect time, just when the king's latest scree against the colonies had hit the streets, his vow to crush them come spring. Common Sense got instant traction. Dumping the monarchy was a radical idea whose time had come. Clearly, this opinion had been growing in people's minds for some time because the Common Sense got instant traction. Thousands of copies are sold. Copies are passed around, printed in newspapers, copied out by hand. So, in the same week, Americans learned that the king was sending an invasion force to batter them into submission, and they began to be ignited by a powerful radical idea that we can say out loud, do we really need Great Britain? Do we really need a monarchy? It's time to part. And then the very next week brought another pair of events that also worked to harden hearts and wills against remaining in the empire. Another town was leveled by British guns. You remember what happened to Falmouth, Massachusetts, the fall before? This time the unlucky town was Norfolk, Virginia, shelled by its own former royal governor, Lord Dunmore. You remember Lord Dunmore? He had spent the fall enraging white Americans by inviting their enslaved laborers to join the British forces. Now he turned his guns on Norfolk. And I will say as well that once the town began to burn, American rebels also stoked those fires. They wanted to burn up the loyalist part of the town. So there was that. In the end, two-thirds of the town was burned, and a good part of it had actually been burned by the Patriot side. Nevertheless, this was a situation of the British beginning this attack, the British turning its guns on another town. And I think this was the first time that a southern colony suffered from British guns. The very next day, January 17th, news came to Congress that the American forces had suffered a huge defeat in Canada. Now, at this time, there were two fronts in this war. There was Boston and there was Canada. Americans were trying to stop a British invasion from the north by securing Canada. They had taken Montreal in November. Congress thought that was great, so they took aim at the biggest prize of all, Quebec. But terrible news came that week. The Quebec campaign was a disaster. Everything that could go wrong did. The soldiers starved on their way to Quebec. They suffered defeat and death in battle once they got there. They were slaughtered by the British there. It's really a grim story. General Montgomery, one of America's most able generals, was killed in point-blank fire. And then on their way home, the forces were struck with smallpox. The Quebec campaign is truly gruesome, harrowing reading. So this was the Americans' first real disaster in war. They had experienced defeat before, but it had always been defeat with hope in it. You know, Americans were defeated, but they performed well. So, for instance, the Battle of Bunker Hill that previous summer, that was an American loss, but Americans had performed well. They had been steady under fire. But the Canada loss, this was a shellacking. This was a miserable defeat. Now, you might think that a massive military defeat would make Americans rethink the whole war thing, right? It might make them think, maybe we can't do this after all. Maybe we can't be successful against so powerful a foe. You might think it might bring them to give it up and submit. But it didn't. It had the opposite effect. Americans were committed to this war. It was win or die. You see this woodcut here, join or die. Benjamin Franklin designed this woodcut back in the 1750s, encouraging colonial unity against the French. And this image had been an emblem of the American struggle ever since the Stamp Act in 1765. And now that the war was on, it was win or die. Even if you favored reconciliation, it's win the war or die, because if you lose your rights. Americans would be forever second-class citizens in the empire, and surely the British Empire would punish Americans for making war. So win or die. And the big lesson about Quebec is that die might be the outcome. The Americans had been lucky so far, but the truth was they were pretty rotten soldiers by regular standards. And in Quebec, all the birds came home to roost. Their inexperience and the lack of discipline and the lack of training and the poor supply and all of it showed. And more British forces are on the way that spring. Remember, the week before, Americans learned that this huge force was headed their way. In fact, it would be the greatest fleet ever assembled so far in history. 40,000 sailors and soldiers would soon be bobbing in ships in New York Harbor. So if the Americans were going to win, and they were committed to win, they were going to need help. The Americans needed a foreign ally, a strong friend to give them money and men and ships and supplies and all the stuff they needed. But if they were going to interest any foreign power in allying with them, they had to commit themselves to independence. That's the point here. They had to commit themselves to independence from Great Britain because other nations were not interested in getting tangled up in a civil war between Great Britain and its colonies. But an independence movement, now we're talking. If we're talking about breaking up the British Empire, that might be worth somebody's while. Somebody like France. And France was already interested. France had already been in touch. Right around this time, a foreign gentleman had reached out to Congress, and he said, I think I can be helpful. This was Achard de Bonvouloir. He was in the colonies at this time. He was claiming to be a Belgian merchant, there merely on business. But in fact, he was not a merchant, and he was not Belgian. He was, in fact, an officer of the French army. He was an agent of the French government. Well, French secret agents in the colonies was nothing new. They had been dropping in and checking things out ever since the 1760s, when France lost its holdings in North America. France and Great Britain were traditional enemies. Britain not getting along with her colonies was great news for France. France had been watching this growing conflict with glee. Maybe this could be the beginning of a beautiful relationship. So Monsieur Bonvouloir found his way to Congress early in January, and a committee of secret correspondence was formed just to talk to him. And like Lord Drummond, he said, we are very impressed. We in France are very impressed by your performance so far on the battlefield. Now, this was before the news of the disaster in Quebec had arrived in Congress. He said, we see that you Americans have the most important thing you need to win a war, which is that your people are willing to fight. All you need are more arms and ammunition and instruction in European warfare and a few other necessary things. Maybe we can help you there. We are very interested in allying with you. And the Americans said, well, that's because you want Quebec back, right? That's because you really want Quebec. And even if we get Quebec, we don't get to keep Quebec. And he said, no, 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 no. If you can conquer Quebec, it's yours. But he said, before France starts helping you out, we have to know that you are on the road to declaring independence. So it is important to know, as we consider the events of the summer of 1776, that Americans thought that France stood ready to ally with them from the get-go. Congress expected an alliance with France to come very shortly after they declared independence. And so they moved with confidence that came from that assumption. Now, as it turns out, that's not what happened. France held off because the Americans started to lose battles and because the home government in France began to drag its feet. So France and the United States did not sign an alliance until early 1778. But that was all part of the unknown future. In the present, early 1776, it was looking like the colonies had a strong international ally waiting in the wings if they declared independence. If they declared independence. The conservatives in Congress were defeated for all time. That debate set for January 24th on independence or reconciliation does not appear to have happened. A handful of reconciliationists never stopped longing to go back to Great Britain, but more began supporting independence. Then came another bombshell. News of yet another punitive measure the Parliament passed on the colonies. This was the Prohibitory Act. It instituted a blockade against all colonial trade. Any American ship found trading, quote, shall be forfeited to his majesty, as if the same were the ships and effects of open enemies. Wow! Now the trading vessels of the colonies were in the same category as ships of open enemies. Okay, if that is not a declaration of war from Great Britain, what is? John Adams, the longtime quiet supporter of independence, said, you might as well call the Prohibitory Act an act of independency. He said, this is going to do it. This is going to tip even more people over into the ranks supporting independence. 3 days after learning of the Prohibitory Act, Congress agreed to send Silas Deane to Paris to explore the depth of France's friendship. And then, right on top of the news of the Prohibitory Act, because again, these events keep coming in pairs, the southern colonies got further confirmation that they too could expect war in the spring. Certain letters were intercepted, as they say, which is to say, the letters were stolen by Americans, and they included letters from the British Secretary of State of the Colonies, Lord Germain, which he sent to one of the royal governors, discussing an invasion of the Carolinas and maybe Virginia. So in the spring, when the British come, they're not coming just for rebellious New England. They were also coming for the southern colonies. And then to add to American confidence, a military victory. The British were pushed out of Boston by the Americans. And this is one of my very favorite stories of the Revolutionary years. I have a talk that I do just about this event. It's a story of an incredible feat by Colonel Henry Knox, who hauled 60 cannons 300 miles over a mountain range in the middle of winter and shocked the British with a surprise bombardment. And then a few weeks later, they deserted Boston. It was daring, it was clever, and it sure made it look like the Americans could win battles. This actually wasn't exactly a battle. Actually, they didn't. I said bombardment. They actually didn't. They just threatened bombardment. So it wasn't actually a battle, but it was a victory. The British left Boston on Washington's timeline. It was Washington. It was General Washington's first victory. It gave Americans hope that they could win this war. And the French took note as well. Let's go back. As spring took hold in America, it was clear that a great change had gone on in the minds and the hearts of most Americans. This idea of independence, a word that last fall you couldn't say aloud hardly, was now a warm and congenial concept. And Richard Henry Lee of Virginia was ready. On June 7th, Lee introduced this resolution in Congress to put to the vote. Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. It was time at last for the vote on independence. But even now, not everyone was on board. Not all of the colonial delegations in Congress had permission from their home colonies to vote in favor of independence. So Congress said, okay, fine, let's postpone the vote for a month. We'll do it in early July. Everybody talk to your home government. But at the same time, Congress appointed a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence to have that ready to go if the vote was in the affirmative. So now the colonies had to take the final step of authorizing their delegates in the Continental Congress to vote for independence. And even now, that was a struggle. Each colony had its own independent story. So Delaware, for instance, Delaware gave permission to vote in favor of independence readily, it seems, but they were still a little squeamish about it. When they talked to their congressional delegates, when they wrote out the instructions to the delegates, they avoided using the I word. They avoided using the word independence. They said, you may concur with other members of Congress. New Jersey had to have a coup before it could get the job done. Their governor was a loyalist, a man named William Franklin. In fact, William Franklin was the son of Benjamin Franklin, and he was a determined Tory. New Jersey arranged to have William Franklin arrested, and then it voted in a new colonial government and put it in the hands of those who supported independence. Pennsylvania also underwent regime change. Its government was very conservative and very Quaker, and they refused to permit their delegates to vote for independence. But the people of Pennsylvania began to protest. They began to gather in numbers and organize, and the government realized that the gig was up, and members of the assembly began to slip away until the assembly could no longer gather a quorum, and then a new government could be formed. But that did not happen until late June, barely in time for the big vote on July 2nd. And New York colony, New York missed the deadline altogether. They insisted on being personally asked by the Continental Congress before they gave their delegates the okay. And that didn't happen until July 9th. So the big vote on July 2nd, they missed altogether. The delegation, the New York delegation actually abstained from that vote. So, on some of the copies of the Declaration of Independence, it includes the words, the unanimous declaration. It was unanimous in that the vote was 12 colonies for, no colonies opposed, and one colony abstaining. Isn't that crazy? Did you know that? Isn't that crazy? Well, July 2nd, 1776, that was the date of the big vote on independence, and it went in the affirmative. But even then, two members of the Pennsylvania delegation found that they could not, in good conscience, vote for independence. So they agreed to step outside during the vote. And one of them was our good buddy Robert Morris. Robert Morris, soon to be the financier of the revolution, never voted in favor of independence, though in the end he did sign the Declaration of Independence. The signing ceremony was not for another month, August 2nd. So he did sign the Declaration. And now we're at the end of our story, which is actually, of course, the beginning of everything else. And it's quite a story, isn't it? I hope this talk has really enriched your understanding of our national story. I hope it's helped you see things a little differently. Maybe humanized the process a little bit, the wobbly, uncertain process of declaring independence. In a minute, I'd like to open up the floor to comments and questions. I'm very curious to know what you're thinking about all this. But when I finished developing this talk, I found myself wondering, could events have broken differently? Could the colonies have actually reconciled with Great Britain? And I don't mean, being merely conquered by warfare, but if the British government had been willing to make concessions, could they have saved the situation? Could they have kept the colonies in the British Empire while granting them the autonomy that the Americans craved? And if they did, would it have worked? Would the Americans have gone for it? Would that have kept the 13 colonies in the empire? Oh, maybe we would have ended up like Canada. Canada was part of the empire until I think it was the 1860s when they went to the Commonwealth system. Maybe that would have been what would have happened with what is now the United States. Or maybe it would have just delayed independence. Maybe the growth and the wealth of the colonies so far away from the mother country, maybe it made it a little more, I don't want to say inevitable. You never want to say inevitable in history, but it made it a little more weighted toward the colonies eventually striking for independence. I don't know. I don't know. Those are where my thoughts run along to. How about you? So please do let me know what you're thinking about. And if you have questions, I will endeavor to answer them.
Okay, thank you, Joyce. So yeah, as a reminder, if you have a question, you should see a Q&A button on your screen, and you can type any questions you have and submit them there. I see two things. We have one person thanking you and saying this was great.
Oh, thank you.
We have okay, a few questions are coming in.
I hope I
Someone
didn't rattle
asked,
out. I
sorry?
just want to say, I hope I didn't rattle along too fast. I'm seeing that I'm ended earlier than I planned on. It's a little harder for me to gauge my pace when I'm just by myself
Oh
speaking
yeah,
to a screen. So anyway,
of course,
okay.
yeah. And if anyone, missed some things, we will upload a recording of this to our YouTube channel, and you will be emailed a link along with a handout that Joyce has prepared. So, But we do have a few questions. One is, how did news fly that fast, both within the colonies as well as over the Atlantic?
Yeah, that's a really good question. As far as over the Atlantic, it didn't fly fast. It would take a month or two for news to cross the Atlantic, and then the other side would have to decide what to do about it, and then another month or two back across. So that was a very slow process. That's, for instance, that speech by George III, it started circulating the news, the text of that speech started circulating in early January. But he had made that speech in October, so it took that long for the news to come. Now, between the colonies, one of the interesting things about the colonies is, first of all, there was an active press in the colonies, very small by our standards, but still an active and viable press. Some dozens of small newspapers, weekly newspapers, and their numbers really grew they grew in numbers during these very years. This was sort of the years when the American press became politicized and Americans really got hooked on political news. So the news would pass from town to town, from colony to colony. They would reprint each other's stuff verbatim and distribute it that way. You could go down to the a pub and read a newspaper there. It's not like there was subscriptions so much, but the newspapers were there were probably subscriptions. I shouldn't say that, but probably the simplest way would be just to pick up a newspaper in a pub and read it there. And then another factor in this was the high levels of literacy for Americans. It did vary by region, but in the North, in New England, where it was compulsory for both boys and girls to be taught to read and write, literacy was probably something like 80, 90%. And it was lower in the South, maybe something more like 50%, with far more men and boys being able to read than women and girls. But nevertheless, that's a very high level of literacy for this time, much higher than in Great Britain. So, and it's really interesting too, just as an aside, um, it's interesting too how much American political tracts were peppered with quotes from philosophers, Greek philosophers, Locke and Montesquieu. Not those aren't Greeks, but English, English Enlightenment philosophers, Locke and Montesquieu, and that crowd. So this was also often a very literate kind of publication as well.
Okay, thank you. Another one here is, what was the final battle in the 1780s to end the war?
That was, well, the final major battle was the Battle of Yorktown, and that was in 1781. There were smaller skirmishes after that because the peace was not signed until 1783. But Yorktown was the final major battle.
Perfect, thank you. And we have another comment saying absolutely fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm not seeing any more questions, but we'll give people a little bit more time in case um, people have more questions. So
I'll talk about these books. How about that?
yeah,
This whole question of the development of independence, for the sentiment going from reconciliation to independence, it really is drawn out in that middle book there, John Ferling, Independence, The Struggle to Set America Free. That's a very interesting, fascinating book. David McCullough's book, 1776. It's an older book now. It's an excellent book. It won the Pulitzer Prize in its time. I strongly recommend that. And then a newer book, Rick Atkinson. He has a trilogy. I think he's still working on the third volume of the trilogy. The first one, which talks about the first couple of years of the war, the British are coming. It is so rich in detail, so rich in yeah, in detail about the Revolutionary Age. I highly recommend that one. I recommend any of these three.
thank you. We have a few more comments coming in. Um, Everyone just thanking you, saying it's very informative. But we do have a few more questions. Okay. One question is, wars cost money. Besides Robert Morris, who else financially supported the war?
Well, Franklin was sent across the ocean to persuade the French to contribute to the war, not just in manpower, but also materially. And then John Adams also rounded up um, uh, um, uh, loans from Dutch bankers as well. So the young United States did borrow heavily from um, foreign sources, from foreign bankers. And those debts were eventually paid off by Alexander Hamilton's system of government bonds, which was another new concept in financing a war at the time.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, when were the terms Democrat and Republicans begin? When did they begin?
That is a really interesting question. So there's Democrat with a small d, and there's Republican with a small r. For a long time, Democrat with a small d was rather close to rabble rouser, someone who wanted to overturn the established government. And Republican, there have been ancient republics. In Greece, there had been the Roman Republic, but modern republics had not fared very well. So the United States founded itself as a republic, and the wealthy men who were in charge of it were very concerned about the Democrats with a small d um, overturning the the established way of doing things. Now, our first system of politics, the first two political parties, we had the Federalists and the Republicans. The Federalists were sort of the conservative business party. The Republicans were the more populist party, if you will. The Republicans were the party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The Federalists were Alexander Hamilton and Washington and John Adams and so forth. Um, Eventually, the Federalists withered and died. And there was a time where we had just one party, but there came to be schisms in the middle of the party. So the Republican Party began to split into the Democratic Republicans, which is very confusing for us these days. And what were the other ones? The National Republicans. So that was again a liberal conservative thing. Um, the the Democratic Republicans eventually became our Democrats. And the National Republicans became not the Republicans, but they became the Whigs, which eventually exploded over the conflicts running up to the Civil War, and that's where we get our Republican Party. So our current Democratic Party has had a single run from Thomas Jefferson forward, but it started off as the Republican Party.
Thank you. Another question is, after reading David McCullough's, it became clear how close a thing our independence was. You're excellent, and this was a rich lecture. Brought this near thing out in colorful, sharp relief. Thank you.
Thank you.
Here's another question. Why did New York abstain from the initial vote on the Declaration of Independence?
The home government dragged its feet, the colonial government of New York dragged its feet on giving its delegates permission to vote in favor. Each delegation had to have permission from the home government, from the colonial government to vote in favor of independence. And New York colony just dragged its feet on it. Um, my understanding is they wanted a personal contact from the Continental Congress on the matter, and that didn't happen in time. Now it happened like a week later, a week after the formal vote. The delegation finally got the permission, and they they signed on. Better late than never, guys. We're in. But yeah, but that's how it happened. And I got to say too, I think the fact that the British Army was invading at the time, that might have also influenced things a little bit.
Someone is asking if you could please define republic versus democracy.
So our nation, I suppose it's best to call it a democratic republic, um, because we have aspects of both. In a republic, you select representatives to go and make the laws. All right, that's part of our system. In a democracy, what they call a pure democracy, you would have a fairly small population, and the population would make the laws, supposedly. All right, so I guess everyone would gather in a great big field and or a great big building and make the laws. I mean, that would work if maybe you had a city state or something like that. Maybe that would work. Would that ever work? I can't imagine that ever working. But anyway, that is the difference. Who's making the laws? Are the people themselves making the laws, or are there representatives who make the laws? And in our system, obviously, the people themselves are not making the laws, but the people are very active in in our influence, in our ability to influence the government.
Thank you. Uh, Someone is asking, could you please tell us a little bit about who Joyce Haworth is? I know I read my introduction in the beginning, but Joyce, would you like a chance to introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, I have been doing these kinds of talks for over 20 years now. I have a master's degree in history from the University of Chicago, and in my career, I really landed in community education. So I have taught for many years in lifelong learning departments of community colleges. Currently, I lecture regularly at College of DuPage and at Oakton College. And also I give talks like this to senior centers like the Levy Center, and also public libraries and retirement communities. My area of specialty is early American history, so that's roughly colonial through Reconstruction, post-Civil War, and Reconstruction. Um, and it's, history has uh, it's always been highly interesting to me. I very much enjoy this particular format. I like working with adults. I enjoy not having to grade. I did do 4 credit classes for a little while. Um, I did not enjoy the grading. I found it personally very difficult to give bad grades to people whom I personally liked, and you want to be on everybody's side and that kind of thing. So this has been a really good fit for me, and I really enjoy it. I spent a lot of time too preparing for these classes. I try to I start off with a question for myself to answer, and I try to do right by the subject, if you will, to do a really full treatment of it.
Absolutely. And also, for those who may not know, we have had Joyce present with us before. She presented on myths in American history, I believe, and you can also find that on our YouTube channel. I do see another ooh, we have a few. One question is, how would the British have been able to kill the independence movement with fairness, if not kindness, if they insisted on protecting Native American land rights?
How would they have killed the independence movement with fairness and kindness while insisting on Native American land rights? That is a great, beautifully thorny question, and I really appreciate you asking that. I don't know that they were actually, what was in the minds of the British was to protect their land rights, anything long term. I mentioned at the very beginning that they did draw a line down the top of the Appalachian Mountains, and they said, okay, colonists, you stay on the east side. On the west side is reserved for the Indian tribes. The purpose for that was to keep Americans from flooding into that region and kicking off Indian wars, which is exactly what they would have done, I'm pretty sure, to grab the land. So they were doing it just to prevent war between colonists and Native Americans. But I do think the long term, well, I don't really know. I was going to say probably the long-term plan was still to divest Native Americans of their land, but I don't know if it was even so much even on the it's a long way to great, there's a lot of, it's a long distance between Great Britain and the New World. And yeah, I don't know what their long-term plan was with that. I don't know if that what their long-term plan was. Um, how could they have persuaded the colonies to abandon independence? Would there be a kindness to do it? of doing it. I think they would have had to give up on they would have had to allow the colonies much more autonomy. Maybe that would have been the answer. You have to stay on your own side of the Appalachians, but fine, you can tax yourselves, you can run your own colonies. Don't let us catch you trading with the enemy. That kind of thing. I don't know. I don't know. I can't really imagine a scenario where the land that is now the United States remained under the control of Great Britain just because the colonies were so prosperous and they were so populous. The population was growing so rapidly, unlike Canada. There were a lot more people in the 13 colonies. And if the independence movement had failed in the 1770s, I bet it would have succeeded, 20, 30 years later.
Thank you. That was a hard question.
It was a great question. Thank you.
It was. We do have another, and it's when, if ever, has the group in power been overthrown by the people for not representing them? And I think this is a follow-up to that same question, state or federal.
Could you read the question again?
Yeah, of course. It's state or federal, when, if ever, has the group in power been overthrown by the people for not representing them?
Well, it seems like that's kind of the definition of a revolution, isn't it? People feel that their interests are not being represented. People feel that the government is a bunch of thugs, perhaps, or they're not being listened to. Um, so I guess I would answer wherever there is revolution and overthrow, that is at the heart what the issue is.
They're following up to the question again, since the revolution, I guess.
Yeah, since the
When, if
revolution.
ever.
Do you, if the asker could specify, do you mean specifically the American people, or is it sort of like peoples in general, peoples around the world?
Domestically, so
Okay,
yeah.
domestically. Um, well, sitting governments really frown on. I mean, there's yeah, there have certainly been times when there has been tremendous pressure on the government from one group or another group, and the way that it's usually been handled is one party will champion that group and bring them into the fold. So you'll start with um, a group that is putting pressure on the system itself, and then they're brought into the political system by one party or another party championing their cause. I think that's how we have usually handled that situation. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. I'm not seeing any more, but we may have some follow-ups. Um, we are running bit low on time, so Joyce, if you have any closings or additional thoughts, be great to hear them.
Thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. And I do have a handout that Geneva will be sending out in the next day or two that summarizes all of this. And I hope you to see you another time at another history lecture. That would really be great.
Absolutely. Yeah. I just saw a comment pop in and it's saying, I suppose the Civil War could be considered a revolution. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, if it fails, it's a civil war, right? If it succeeds, it's a revolution. Our American Revolution was effectively a civil war until it succeeded. Um, so yes. So you could look at our Civil War as a failed revolution
Yeah.
from the Southern point of view,
Um,
obviously.
Someone is asking, could you repeat how long it took for news to cross the Atlantic?
It took a month or two. It seems that it was faster to go from west to east. You could often boogie across the ocean in a month. Going the other direction is more often 6 weeks, 2 months, sometimes even longer. I mean, if you're really unlucky, it could be many more months. But usually going from east to west, it was 6 weeks or 2 months, somewhere in there.
Thank you. Another question popped up. It's Canada is a commonwealth of the United Kingdom. Why didn't America become part of that commonwealth?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you could argue that if Great Britain had done things a little more carefully, shall we blame it on King George? Let's just go ahead. Let's go for it. Let's just blame it on the king, at least for a couple minutes here. We'll blame it on him, and we'll say if Great Britain had been a little more clever about things, and in the same way that a wise parent of a teenager, you catch the kid smoking pot, you handle it a little wisely. You don't necessarily, kick him out of the house or whatever, lower the boom. You gotta handle this kind of wisely. The British colonies were growing strong and prosperous, and the relationship needed to evolve a little bit more. But there was no framework for that either. There was no room in people's heads, I think, except for a subject. You can be a subject or you can be a rebel, and those were kind of the only options. I think it's significant that the Commonwealth did not evolve until the middle of the 19th century. The 1860s, I think, is when the Commonwealth first began to develop. That's a long time after the 1770s. So maybe it's just that the time wasn't ripe for it. But again, even just with the strength and the population um, of the 13 colonies that became the 13 states, I just have a hard time believing that Americans would have been content to continue under an authority so far away and perhaps so prohibiting to them.
Thank you. Um, I'm not seeing any more come in right now, but we can give it a little bit. Right. I'll read my closing. And if you have any final thoughts, anyone, if you want to type that into the Q&A, I'll read them afterwards. But thank you all for joining us today, and we will be uploading a recording to our YouTube channel. You will be emailed a link as well as the handout within about a week. And before you go, please consider supporting the Levy Senior Center Foundation with a donation today. You can donate online at lscfevanston.org. Your donations help us continue creating opportunities for older adults in our community by providing programming such as today's lecture, as well as making needed improvements to the Levy Senior Center. And thank you again, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more, so thank you, Joyce.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this time. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Bye.
Bye-bye.